This is the Solid Signal podcast for the week of June 26th, 2023. And this is going to be one of those podcasts where I get a little bit off topic. I try to mix those in because I don't think that people would keep coming back if I was just trying to sell them stuff. And well, maybe I'm a little bit full of myself, but I like to think that sometimes people like to hear what I have to say about stuff and random stuff too. If that sounds like something you're interested in, keep on listening. And if not, well, I'll see you next week on the Solid Signal podcast. Seriously, though, the subject of this week's podcast is artificial intelligence. It seems like more and more, this is a topic that we cannot get away from, and it is possibly the defining topic of 2023. And, it seems like every week we are hit by an interesting consequence of AI, an interesting limitation of AI, and a way that AI can do things that we never thought possible. And how this is different, this moment I think is different from other technological changes, and I'll explain why, at least why I think so. The basis of this podcast came from two events that happened this week in my life, and they are almost opposite, and yet both illustrate the scary bits about artificial intelligence that are beginning to invade our world. The first was that I read something that was written by ChatGPT, and while it sounded completely plausible, it was in fact 100% total falsehood. It was as if ChatGPT just didn't know the answer and simply made it up. The same way that, say, a second grader would do that if you asked him the answer to a question that he hadn't done his reading on. It brings up an important limitation of what artificial intelligence, especially generative AI, can do, and why it's scary because of how convincing generative AI can seem in its answers. The other thing was, as I said, almost the complete opposite. I was playing with Photoshop's new generative fill option, which I don't think is as good as some of the other image generators like Midjourney, but it is kind of free if you have Photoshop, and I have Photoshop, so I've been playing around with it a lot. The AI tools that are part of Photoshop really, it's not that they in themselves scare me, but they make me feel like a bit of a relic. Because when I look at what this AI is able to do in under 5 seconds and compare that with what would have taken me an hour to do or more back in the 1990s when I used to do a lot of Photoshop work, well, honestly, I find the AI does it better, and it's certainly a lot faster. And what does this mean for the kind of work that I used to do, and why is that important? So let's kind of deep dive into those two things. More and more, we're finding out that people are using ChatGPT to try to get answers. And I think that's a mistake. Matter of fact, I know it's a mistake because ChatGPT does not know the answers. The interesting thing about ChatGPT is that it's been trained to try to fudge the answers. We don't know exactly how it does that. That's a really closed part of the entire artificial intelligence system. Previously, when we had other tools that made our lives easy, we knew how they worked. When smartphones took the place of filing clerks or secretaries, we knew why, and we knew what the code was doing. I mean, at least somebody did. It wasn't like the average person did, but somebody knew what that code was doing. When you're talking about a generative AI, what you basically present it with a training set that is as large as you can possibly make it, and put in information that is relevant to each piece of training. And then you just kind of keep shoving that at the AI until it gets what sounds like the right answer in a really opaque kind of way. And most of the generative AIs cannot tell you how they got to the answer they got to. There's no facility for tracing through those steps. And even if there was, I'm not quite sure that people could understand it. That's a little bit scary to me, more than a little bit, because it tells me that at some point we will use ChatGPT or one of its successors for something really critical, like, running our nation's nuclear power plants or something scary like that, or creating vaccines for diseases. And it will do a really, really good job until it doesn't. until it makes a decision that we cannot understand and presents information that is demonstrably false in a way that makes it seem like it's actually true. I honestly think that at the rate we're going, we're no more than a year or 2 years away from something like that if we're not extremely careful. The difference, again, as I'll say, is that in the past, when we had labor-saving devices, whether it was something like a typewriter or a car or a computer or whatever, we understood, at least somebody understood what it was doing, and it didn't have the capability of outgrowing its own facility. And honestly, artificial intelligence today is not like that. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that it's going to be just like Skynet in Terminator 2, but I'm also not going to suggest that, because it seems to me that that's still a very real possibility if we invest too much trust in these kind of systems. Now, when I was looking at this Photoshop example of how I asked ChatGPT to remove something from background, it did it instantly. I asked it to put a purple spotted lizard in front of a tree. It did that with great precision in an extremely realistic way. There was practically nothing I could throw at it that it didn't just do really well, even in its current limited beta form. And I got around to thinking back a long, long time ago, I was part of a vanguard of folks who were starting to use computer typesetting and Photoshop and that sort of thing to do commercial print work. I remember a very long time ago, I showed one of the old typesetters, one of the guys who was setting type by hand, letter by letter, how you could change the font and size of something in a fraction of a second with just one click of a mouse. He threw up his arms and he said, well, that's it for me. Because he knew that if he were to try to do the same thing, it would take him 15 minutes just to reset one line of type. And he wasn't wrong. I mean, I will say there were easier ways of doing it than the ways he was doing it, but that's not the point. The point is that the extraordinary capability of the computer had rendered a lot of what he did obsolete. And that was a real shame. It really was. And as I look at now, Photoshop has the ability to render a lot of what I used to do obsolete, removing things from their backgrounds and adding things that weren't there before, cleaning up photos or whatever. All that stuff is almost instantaneous now with the AI tools that Photoshop has. Now, this is a part that isn't terribly surprising. It's not hard to understand, and I'm a little less scared of it. People say that, they should be scared about it. But you know what? We weren't, we didn't get to a point where Photoshop took over the world and we couldn't trust our eyes and ears. We just developed a much keener sense of when something was Photoshopped. And I think that's going to be harder to do with generative fills because they're so well done, but we'll get there. That part doesn't worry me. What worries me is the way the human experience factors into that. The guy who I showed that type demonstration to, those many years ago, had been working in the print industry for about 45 years. He had started doing something extremely inconsequential, probably like washing something or sweeping something or whatever. And he kind of worked his way up until he was a master craftsman. He knew what he was doing and he could do it really, really well. And along came a machine that in a matter of seconds could do what he did 100 times better and 100 times faster. Well, I didn't really think about it then, but here I am much, much later. I started my career in the commercial printing industry many, many years ago, and I started by sweeping floors. I worked my way up, maybe not as painstakingly because the world was a different place, but I learned a lot of the rules before I broke them, and I used a lot of those classical kind of tools to try to understand those things. I had no choice because the technology wasn't advanced enough to let me do what I wanted to do all the time. Well, now, pretty much anybody can pick up a copy of Canva for free that's a web-based client and do about 80% of what any commercial Photoshop user could do for free. And somebody who's willing to pay about $30 a month and who is willing to watch a number of YouTube videos can figure out how to do the rest of it in a completely satisfying way. at the risk of sounding like Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park, what we've done is we've created a system where you have all this power, but you did absolutely nothing to earn it. You just stood on the shoulders of others, as Goldblum said in that particular film. You didn't stop to think whether or not you should. You just went out and did it. And I think there's something about that we have lost. I think that if you spend the time truly earning your skills, it takes a long time to do. But on the other hand, you really understand from the inside out why those skills are important. And that's something that we have lost. I'm not going to say we're on the verge of losing it. I think we have lost it. And it's probably too late to get it back. And artificial intelligence is just more proof that now exists. So what we have is we have these two things coming together. We have the ability for artificial intelligence to create extremely convincing things that are completely untrue. They didn't happen. They're not realistic. They're just, they're a flat out lie. Like, for example, when artificial intelligence told a lawyer of certain cases, it started quoting case laws that did not exist. We have artificial intelligence that's capable of doing these things. We have no idea of how it knows whether or not it's telling the truth or not, or whether or not it knows it's telling the truth or not. And that in itself is really scary. Now, it's hard to say how quickly these things are growing because we have no measure for how much more complex they're getting. Nothing we apply to it seems to make any sense whatsoever. And so we don't know in what ways artificial intelligence is getting smarter. We don't know how fast it's getting smarter. We don't know what else it's capable of doing. And that means in the end, we don't understand some of the key things that could make artificial intelligence a real threat in the next several years. It's not just me, folks. Some of the brightest minds in the country have urged a sense of great caution when it comes to artificial intelligence, not because we want to hold people back or because we don't think it's a good tool to have or because it couldn't solve some of the world's issues. It's not that. It's that we do not understand what we are doing. And when you don't understand what you're doing, you are prone to making really, really big mistakes. I'm going to go way off base here and say one of the big mistakes that we could really potentially be making is not understanding the very nature of awareness and sentience. It sounds like science fiction to say that we could be creating machines that are going to grow at such an exponential rate that they could become self-aware and sentient enough. And we wouldn't know it. We wouldn't know how to measure it. And we wouldn't even know if it happened. And when you have that kind of gap in your knowledge, then naturally there are going to be problems. As soon as you create a computer whose feelings are capable of being hurt, then you're almost innately going to hurt its feelings because the things we ask computers to do are really meaningless and stupid. Can you imagine if Google had feelings? If you went to search for something and like the first 10 things that it suggested, you just said, no. And you just kept going? And it just in the end, it just turned out you were searching for porn anyway. Don't you think that Google's feelings would be incredibly hurt by that? I mean, if you were a person trying to do that exact same thing, trying to help somebody find something, and it rejected the first 15 things that you suggested and then just went to porn, well, you'd be pretty hurt. But at least that would be expected from a human. We have no idea of knowing at what point, or if ever, or if it is possible, that the artificial intelligences that we create are going to turn into real intelligences. And when or if they do, what the consequence will be. Because, I don't want to get too political here, but we do in this, as a human race, have this history of treating other people as if they were not people, as if they were machines. And then we find out they are actual people. They prove to us they are actual people. And we don't tend to take that very well. We don't tend to react really well to that. And that becomes a really driver of catastrophic change. Now take that with computers that we could theoretically be given control of our air supply, our water supply, our food supply, all of our knowledge, all of our communications infrastructure, everything about modern life. And we are going to treat them like crap, and we are not going to realize when they are capable of rising up and overtaking us. Now, again, I know I'm going way off base, but when you think about it, it's not really that far away. It's not, and it could be closer. It could be today. We just don't know. That's what I'm saying. That's what a lot of other really much smarter than me people are saying, is that we should really put a pause on things until we know. Not stop doing things, because this technology is already here. Somebody is going to use it, but try to understand how it's being used, why it's being used, and what's going on behind the scenes, to the extent that we can try to see when we are using it properly. I think it's probably already grown beyond our control. That ship has already sailed, but at least we could try to understand at what point we should really try to change our relationship with these artificial intelligences for our own good. Okay, I know this all has sounded quite a lot like a mix of Black Mirror and the Terminator and a lot of other science fiction-y types of things. But folks, you are kidding yourself if you do not think that that's where we are right now. It's just something to think about. As I sit here recording this podcast, and a machine is automatically balancing out the sound on it and doing who knows what other kind of processing, and yet I'm just letting it, and I'm telling it all these things. It's time for us to really start thinking about this stuff, because it's already happening. It already has happened. That's kind of a scary place to leave it, but that's where I'm going to leave it today, because this is probably my longest podcast to date here on the Solid Signal podcast. I'm going on, and I appreciate you listening. I'll leave it here with just, please, be thoughtful about this kind of stuff. Don't be surprised if it's more advanced than you even considered already. To the extent that it's possible, have a great week.